Hey y'all! Well, if you're new to the channel, welcome. And we're kind of venturing into a different segment of audio than we normally do on this channel, which is tube audio. And what I'm looking for is trying to find some reasonably priced audio gear that can be had by anyone with a little bit of DIY skill. So, did an earlier review on both these little Class D amplifiers. This one that gets a lot of great reviews, honestly, I wasn't super impressed with. This is the, what is this guy, the A07 Max. And yeah, there's people out there claiming this is, giant killer, that this thing sounds better than a $5,000 amp. It's like, I don't know what they've been listening to, but it's, for the price point, it's not a bad little amp. And honestly, I didn't do what some people are saying you have to do and buy two of these and put them in mono and run them as, mono block or, single channel amp, whatever thing. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then you're running two power bricks, and then you're supposed to have to upgrade this power brick from 36 volts to 48 volts to really make them sound good. And I tried the 48 volt brick that this one came with, and I didn't notice any kind of change exactly in the sonic signature. And like I said in another video, we're not doing like measurements and stuff. That's been done to death on these little Class D amps. And my test equipment isn't real happy working with this stuff. It's more tube amp kind of measuring gear. You can see my ancient Tektronix scope and stuff. So yeah, we're just going to talk subjective listening here. And what we're doing today is very subjective. And I'm sure somebody could get into scientifically measuring that. Again, we're not doing that in this video. I'm just going to let you know what this thing sounds like to me after upgrading it with some Sparkos op amps. And so he was nice enough to send me a pair of them after we talked for a couple hours the other day, and I was intrigued about what that might bring to the table. And of course, I can understand how discrete components laid out on little circuit boards could sound very different than a IC chip might. And so, with an open mind, I went into this thing. Was going to use one of these two, and I decided to use this one, the A70, because to me, it sounds better bassline than this one does. And no pun intended, it was the bassline that made it sound better. The bass is tighter, it's punchier, it doesn't sound as flappy, and I'm not sure if it's the different feedback loop that they're using with this design. Supposedly they put out the same power. I would temper your expectations on that 300 watt power. Probably more around 30 real watts driving into speakers like 8 ohm, like most speakers are, at realistic distortion levels. I'm sure maybe a 10% distortion, which is something you'd never want to hear out of a solid state device, that it might make some kind of power numbers, whatever. But when I started pushing it very far beyond what like an EL34 tube amp would produce sound pressure level in my room with my RP600M speakers that have had a couple of mods, capacitor tweaks in it, that I started hearing some distortion. And it may have only been like 0.5%, but 0.5% of distortion out of a solid state is not going to sound good. Whereas 0.5% of distortion in a tube amp, or even 2% distortion in a tube amp, is probably going to sound good. And so, kind of apples and oranges there, but I'm just, again, not going to argue about what it measures at. I'm just talking about real in-room performance, what to expect out of this. And if you've got some 80 decibel ancient technology speakers or some Magnapans or something, that this may not have the drive that you're looking for. But reasonable speakers, reasonably sized room, with reasonable expectation of sound pressure level, this thing's got plenty of power. So I also want to be upfront about this. I'm not sure exactly what these op amps are actually doing in the circuit. I'm kind of understanding that they're sort of like the driver tube in a tube amp or the input tube, where it's doing the initial amplification of the signal before it's sent to the main amplifier part of the circuit. And if I'm wrong, you can put in the comments below, but that's kind of my understanding about what's going on. And I am going to do an interview with Andrew Spark from Sparkos soon. We're trying to just figure out the logistics of it and how to record that best so it's a quality interview for you guys. But we'll go more in depth about what those are and why his do what they do. So next, we're going to go inside this thing, and I'm going to show you how to physically swap out these op amps. It's not super difficult. There's a couple of different ways of dealing with these speaker jacks, and in case you guys from Aiyima are watching, if you added about 1 inch of wire to these speaker leads, you'd be able to just kind of turn the board at an angle and slide it out with the guts. But the wires are so short, I couldn't get it to do that without feeling like it was going to, damage the circuit board. And so I used my trusty HiFi soldering iron. It's the FX888D. Anyway, I'll put this in the link below. There's definitely cheaper soldering irons if this is the only time you're going to be using one. You could just use a little pencil type. And as I talk about in the DIY section, you could just use a little wrench or a little pair of pliers and undo the nuts and leave the solder joint alone. But that's going to be a real pain. And they've got some paint on the screws, so I would recommend using a little soldering pencil or some sort of soldering iron and unsolder the wire so you can get the back cover off. But anyway, don't want to get too far into that because I'm going to show you that right now. Okay, so let's see what it takes to get inside this little A70 chip amp to replace the op amp. And my friend over at Sparkos Labs sent me 3 of these, the 3602 or SS3602 op amps. And then he also included a couple of these little dip socket risers in case I need those. I'm not sure if I will or not. So we'll find out here in a minute whether we need these risers or not. And it looks like I'm going to need 3 of these op amps. There's one for each channel. And then I think there's one for the balanced input. So let's see what it takes to get inside this thing. First of all, as you can see, there's no hardware on the front of it. There are a couple of screws here on the bottom, and I've already split this thing open, and I've got the little pile of screws right here that I took out of it. There's 2 different Allen wrenches needed. I think it was this one and this little guy here. The ones in the bottom have a slightly smaller size. Honestly, these aren't even labeled, so I have no idea what they are. I just have a pile of Allen wrenches that I use when I'm working on stuff. Anyway, assume they're probably metric. Let's move these out of the way for now. So these first 2 in the bottom are machine screws, and then on the back there's 4 machine screws in the corners, and then these are wood screw, kind of just normal screws, coarser thread, self-tapping things, and they hold these XLR jacks and the RCA jacks to the back panel. So you need to remove all of those. So the next thing you do is the back panel will come loose, and I've already done this. I tried to figure out a way to pull this and twist it, and I couldn't get this to slide out of the case with the guts. And so you could come in with a little pair of pliers or a wrench and unscrew these. To me, it was a lot easier to just unsolder them. And then before I did, I got a black paint marker, and I came in and marked the negative ones, as you can see here. Hopefully you can see. Put a little black paint mark on the 2 negative ones, and they basically line up with those. So it's relatively impossible to put it back together wrong. And so I've got 2 marked with black, 2 positives. Once you get this unsoldered and get this out of your way, the outer case just slides off. And then here's the guts of the amplifier. Now at this point, we need to separate this bottom board from the upper board, and they're just connected together with these pins. So you just kind of gently separate like that. And then once you get these separated, you just pull this out of your way. And here's where we're going to be working. And it actually may not have 3 op amps inside this one. I'm seeing 2. There's a left and a right. And I think the Fozzies have 3. They've got an extra one that goes for the XLR, but you can look with me. I'm not seeing any other op amps. And then let's turn the board over, make sure that we're not missing anything. And nope, not seeing any on that side either. Let's take a good look on this board. Not seeing any there. And then not seeing any here either. So it looks like that you only need 2 to upgrade this amp, which is a good thing. Saves you some money. So anyway, let's get to swapping out these op amps so we can go listen to this thing. So I've got this little tool here that came with one of my keyboards for like pulling the keys off. I'm sure they have dedicated little chip pulling things. You could probably use just a screwdriver as well. One thing to note before you pull it out, and let me zoom in here and show you this. You want to note the orientation of the chips. If you put these in backwards, it will fry them. So you need to know where number 1 is. And you can see on the board, it's got number 1, and it's got this little dot on the chip itself. So we want to orient the number 1, obviously, to the number 1 on the board. So it's going to be kind of hard to screw this up. Okay, so let's get our little tool here and see if I can pull these out without drama. And gently rock them back and forth. And one side came out before the other, but that's fine. And you just want to be careful you don't destroy the pins on these, because who knows, you may want to put this back in, or you might end up selling this thing later and you want to put these op amps into a future amp. So next thing we're going to do is, doesn't look like we're going to need the risers at all. I think there's plenty of room around this. You want to make sure that you discharge any static that may be in your body by touching something big, metal, a ground outlet, something, a little ground pin on an outlet, water pipe, something that will discharge the static electricity. And then let's zoom in on this little guy too. You can see the number 1 on this board in the little gold corner. That's the number 1 pin. You want to make sure you orient these correctly. We make sure our number 1 is lined up with our number 1. Make sure all the pins are lined up, and bam, just like that, we have our discrete op amp upgrade. So let's pull this other one out. And as you can see, there's, well, at least as far as replacing these chips, there's no soldering. And as I pointed out, you could remove those nuts and not have to do any soldering on those speaker jacks. But I thought it was easier and less time consuming to just unsolder those wires, and we'll solder them back as we reassemble the amp. And again, you have the number 1 right there on the board, and we've got the number 1 on our upgraded chip. Again, just carefully make sure that the pins are lined up with those holes and just slide it in place like that. And now we have our upgraded discrete op-amp chips installed. So next thing we do is we take our board, and I think it's going to be easier to kind of slide it in like that, and then make sure you line up these pins that connect the two boards to each other. Once you get this side kind of started, you could actually go ahead and snap those in, and then just flip it over and make sure these are lined up. Slide those together. Make sure it's all happily reconnected. So then these vents here in the bottom go towards the back. And you just slide this back in place. Now there are a couple of grooves in this case that these boards align with. So you want to make sure that you get those aligned. And you might have to play with it a little bit. But once you get everything aligned, it just slides back together like that. Now the way I did it, I'm going to have to come back here and solder these wires back onto this terminal board. So let me do that real quick. And like I was saying before, you can see the 4 wires in the same order that they're soldered onto this board. But marking them with a little black marker like I did, you can see these 2 were marked with some black paint, that I know those 2 are the negatives. So let me solder this back together, and then I'll show you how to finish putting this back together. So now once you got the wires connected back to their terminals, whether you solder them or whether you take these nuts off, and they did put a little glue on them, which honestly, if I had a complaint, they should make these wires just maybe an inch or 2 longer, and then you could simply just turn this board sideways and slide it out with the guts. Because they do advertise that there's replaceable op amps, but the way this thing is assembled, it makes it difficult to get inside it to change them, mainly because these wires are so short. You can't just like pull this up and twist it sideways where it can slide out with the guts. That would make this thing a whole lot easier to open up to change the op amps. Anyway, at this point, you just pop this rear cover back on, and then once you get the cover back in place, make sure it's seated inside that groove. And I would start in the corners and with these machine screws, and that'll sandwich the whole thing back together. And then put the rest of the screws in, and then we'll be done upgrading this little Class D amp with some new op amps. Well, as you can see, that wasn't real difficult, and you can do it without soldering. Like I said, I wish there was a little more length on the wires going to these speaker jacks, and there's plenty of room underneath the circuit board for a little bit longer wire to be in here, and then you could just kind of turn that rear panel diagonally after you unbolt everything and just slide it through the main chassis out the front without having to do any soldering or removing those nuts. So maybe in the future they'll add an inch of wire or so to the speaker connectors and simplify that process. But as is, not hard. It's 4 little solder joints, super easy. You don't even have to be very good at soldering to do that. It's not like working with circuit boards or anything. You're just soldering a wire onto a tab that's already tin and has solder on it. So don't be afraid of doing that. And obviously the little chips just pull out, stick in, super easy. So what do I think about the change sonically? It's night and day. This is a really nice sounding little amp now. I was shocked at the transformation. Before, people were making comments like, you know, these Class D amps suck the life out of the music. And I tend to agree. And the easiest way to explain this, in my opinion, was before the soundstage sounded two-dimensional, like looking at a photograph. It just, you know, you could hear the left and the right channels, but it was very just flat, two-dimensional sounding, and I could hear the speakers clearly. Like, okay, there's sound coming out of this speaker, there's sound coming out of this speaker. After putting these op amps on, the sound became three-dimensional. And it was like looking through a Viewmaster in a 3D slides or with VR goggles versus looking at a computer screen. Maybe that'll resonate with some people. And maybe if you're older folks will know what a Viewmaster is, like I had when I was a kid. But it's that kind of effect visually that happens sonically. There's a track I listened to from Earl Klugh, Master of Suspense. And the reason I listen to that is like the first 30 seconds of it, it's not, I want to say it's not musical, but it's not the music I'm listening to. There's a few things that are almost like sound effects that have a very unique sound that changes with whether you're changing tubes or whether you're changing speakers. I mean, it's very sensitive passage. At the start of it, there's sounds like a firework kind of sparkler going across the sky. It's like this, and it fades out. And when it's two-dimensional, you can hear it going left to right. But when a system is holographic, virtual audio, VR audio, whatever you want to call that, you can hear it almost coming from behind your shoulder to off to the right deep. It's kind of at an angle. And then it's got a sound where you can almost hear the sprinkles coming off a sparkler falling to the ground. And before, when it would play that sound, it was just like a rush of wind that didn't have that little sparkle, and it was just two-dimensional. But with these op amps, it picked up some of the three-dimensionality, and you could hear the little pixie dust sparkles falling off of the sound as it went across, which is a difficult thing to pick up, and now this little amp does that. The other thing is there's a real hollow drum hit that if it's two-dimensional sounding, you just hear this bong kind of, and it stops. Where now with these op amps, you can hear it going back away from you, which is, again, a difficult thing for a lot of amps to do, and now this little guy is doing that. So before you guys are saying, so I guess you're going to throw away your tube amps. Sorry guys, it still doesn't have that. And while the bass is, again, like next level improved from what it was, it still doesn't have the punch and the kick that a really good tube amp has in the bass. And it doesn't have the mid-range warmth with the horns and stuff that a tube amp does. But it sounds really good. I mean, I'm thoroughly impressed. And so, out of the box, this gets a it's okay review. With the Sparkos op amps in it, it gets a Skunkie approved rating. I mean, this is really nice, guys. And especially if you've got like a secondary system that you use for like background music, it's going to be awesome. And there's almost no point in spending the extra money buying something like a tube amp or some other high-end thing, especially if it's for casual listening or for background kind of music. And if you're on a budget, even as your main amp for now, until you can maybe afford something better, go buy this before you buy some cheap China tube amp that sounds like ass. This fits that bill. And so, again, I'm super impressed with these op amps. It made a huge difference in the way this thing sounds. Thank you to the viewer who recommended that and then I think contacted Sparkos in my behalf. And thanks Andrew for sending these over and hooking me up with these things. This is just an awesome little thing now. The only complaint I have is with the sub out, and I'm not using the sub out, and I'm not going to use a powered sub with this in my upstairs system. Possibly would in my downstairs system because it doesn't have the room acoustics that really pull out the bass, and I'm using smaller little Klipsch bookshelf speakers. I wish this was a switchable high pass filter rather than a low pass filter. And then I'll tell you why. Most people that are going to be using this little box, they're going to be using it with a powered sub. Powered sub's already got a low pass filter. It doesn't matter what signal you send it. You don't need to be able to adjust from 150 to 600 hertz as the cutoff point because the powered sub does that. Every powered sub I've ever seen on the planet has that knob on it, and if you send it a 10K signal, well, not going to hurt it. It's just going to throw it in the bin. What would be useful is if that was a high pass filter that had that same range, or maybe lower, maybe from like 80 to 300, something in that range, where you could limit what's going to your small bookshelf speakers to that range, and then have the sub out just send everything to the sub and let the sub handle that with its adjustment. And then you could balance, the mid-range versus the low frequencies with this box and your sub by the knob here, and then maybe have a switch on it where you could just defeat it if you didn't need it and you weren't going to use the sub out next to the sub out jack. And I honestly haven't found this RCA plus 3 dB to really be of much value. I'm not sure when people would even use that. And it even warns in the instruction books about not overdriving this thing. But for my use, when I'm using it with more full range kind of speakers, it's good just like it is. And I'm sure it'll be fine with a powered sub. But if anything, to me, the bass seems a little weak or a little not punchy, a little distorted, flappy sounding compared to the rest of the range. And so if you could not have that part of the frequency done with this amp and hand that off to a subwoofer, you might get something that really sounds spectacular, especially for, what are you going to have in this thing, $350 all in with the op amps and buying it? So, yes, giving this a highly recommended. I mean, it's a nice sounding little thing once you put those op amps in it. And as a partner to this, and I'm going to put a link in the description to this with my Amazon affiliate link, and also this one, which honestly I don't recommend this. Just go ahead and buy this. And I'll also put a link to where you can get some of those Sparkos op amps. This little Dragonfly Red. If you don't have a DAC and you're looking for some way of converting the signal from your, streaming from your laptop or even your phone to something like this, get one of these little Dragonfly Reds. It's awesome. And you can just run a USB cable from this with a USB-C adapter to your phone, and then run whatever streaming app you want to, stream it to this little guy, and you're going to have awesome music playing out of this thing too. And these little things are reasonably priced. Again, didn't say cheap audio because somebody else is already doing that. We're doing reasonably priced audio. So anyway, I think that kind of wraps up this video. Hope you've enjoyed this content. If you have, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Please comment below. Whatever you want. I try to be interactive in the comments. I know sometimes I get a little snarky, but hey, sometimes I can be a little snarky. Thanks to you Patreon supporters. Thanks to you people that have subbed, that regularly watch the channel, and especially you folks that have sent me products to review, or amps to look at, or test, or made donations. All that's what makes this channel possible. And until the next video, as I show you how to do quality audio on a reasonable budget, have a nice day.